Hello, today we're going to talk about abnormal psychology. There are specific courses that are dedicated to abnormal psychology, so we will not go in depth on these behaviors, but I will strongly encourage you to enroll in an abnormal psychology class because they're fun and you'll learn more about each of the behaviors or disorders that we're going to be talking about today. First thing is, what is abnormal behavior? There's not a universal definition for abnormal behavior. There's not a universal definition for what's normal. And so you have to look at what society will accept, what culture will accept, what statistically is common, and also how much distress or dysfunction a behavior causes before it can be labeled an abnormal behavior. Now, the book that classifies all the abnormal behaviors that psychiatrists and therapists and social workers, we all use this as a reference to telling us about the disorder, about the symptoms of the disorder, and what is necessary to diagnose the disorder. The DSM, it's in its 5th edition. It's the DSM-5 lists 20 categories of disorders, but it covers more than 300 different types of disorders. And it doesn't give directions on how to do therapy or medicate the disorder. It just describes and discusses the disorder. There are 4 different ideas or theories on what causes disorders, and you have to actually look to each specific disorder to discuss the actual cause or origin. But basically it does boil down to either it's a biological, a psychological, a sociological, or a biopsychological type of cause, or we call it etiology. Okay. This is just a little chart here to show that when a person is acting out of the norm, it can be a mild abnormal behavior or moderate, or then they actually start getting into less severe psychological disorders or severe psychological disorders. And so you can act a little weird, which is a mild abnormality, and not be not exhibiting the type of behavior that would be classified as a disorder. The first ones we're going to talk about is called anxiety disorders or trauma disorders, also OCD or obsessive compulsive disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder is just somebody who worries chronically. They worry more than they don't. We call it free-floating anxiety, and that's where it's chronic worry. Sometimes they'll even worry why they're not worrying, why they don't have something to worry about. It's excessive worry about a number of events. Often they don't have an identifiable cause, and it can last for less than 6 months. Panic disorder is characterized by having intense attacks of fear that can be disabling, and that it recurs. It recurs over and over again. So it's characterized by recurrent, abrupt experiences of unexpected, intense fear accompanied by physical symptoms. Those physical symptoms, they can be shortness of breath, chest pains, sweating, pains, nausea. In fact, a lot of times people will, when they have a panic attack, the first time they'll think that they're having a heart attack, and they'll go to the emergency room, and then they'll find out that instead of a heart attack, they're actually having an anxiety attack. Another type of anxiety attack is the PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. In World War I, they call this battle fatigue. In World War I, they called it shell shock. In World War II, they called it battle fatigue. And in the Vietnam War was when we really started identifying that this is a problem that occurs with our guys who see the atrocities of war, and our women as well, who see the atrocities of war, and they started putting it together that this was something that was a condition that happened, and we realize now that war and things that they see in war has a long-lasting effect. But then we found out it wasn't just associated with war. PTSD can be associated with witnessing a horrible event or experiencing a horrible event, and it doesn't have to be war. It could be witnessing somebody being tortured, or it could be somebody who had a horrible sexual attack. It could be disaster workers, people who worked the 911 disaster scene. Many of them develop PTSD. So this is results from exposure to a traumatic event, and basically it's results from either feeling intense fear for your life, or feeling intense fear because you're witnessing something bad happening to somebody else, or participating in working a disaster or some kind of natural traumatic event. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, obsession is intrusive, repetitive thoughts. Your compulsion are repetitive actions, repetitive behaviors. And so OCD is the presence of recurrent, persistent, intrusive thoughts with a combination of having repetitive behaviors or mental acts that drives a person to perform these behaviors. That's the compulsion. Now, you can have obsessions without having compulsions. There's another type of anxiety disorder called hoarding disorder. These are characterized by persistent, difficult in discarding possessions. They tend to accumulate and clutter their living areas, and this can cause significant distress and impairment in their functioning, and actually it can cause a lot of distress in the functioning of the people that live with them. We have a group of disorders called dissociative disorders. We also have somatic disorders. Dissociative disorders is a loss of connection with some part of our consciousness, our identity, or our memory. Falling under dissociative disorders are your what's called dissociative identity disorders, or multiple personalities. Multiple personalities are often confused with schizophrenia. They are not the same. Schizophrenia got its name, schizophrenia. Basically, people talk about having a split mind, which is actually a split from reality. The old term, multiple personality, the new term, dissociative identity disorder, there is a literal split within the person into different, two or more personalities, okay? They will take on a completely different personality when they are in that personality, and they will switch from personality to personality. And it's a very, very interesting disorder. We go into it a lot in our abnormal class. But basically, it's caused by a severe trauma. There's somatic disorders, and this means that they will have some kind of physical complaint in which there's no physical cause. Somatic symptoms would be just, like, okay, I've got my stomach hurts, my head hurts. Now, illness anxiety disorder used to be called hypochondriasis, and this is where a person worries about contracting a disease or overly obsessed with their different functioning elements of their body, such as if they get a stomach ache, worrying about having stomach cancer, or if they get a headache, worrying about whether they have brain cancer. Conversion disorder is when they will have some kind of paralysis, but there's no physical reason for the paralysis. And factitious disorder, this is when they will cause themselves to have an illness. We used to call it Munchausen's, okay? And that's where they will deliberately do something to make themselves sick to get attention. Mood disorders, basically, we're talking about depression and what's called bipolar disorder. Depression involves a depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure in one's usual activities. Changes in sleep patterns, either sleeping too much or too little. Changes in appetite, such as eating too much or too little. Motor functioning problems, and even fatigue or a loss of energy. Bipolar disorders, we used to call bipolar manic depression. And there are three types, but the one that most people think about are severe shifts in moods between feeling very, very depressed or very, very hyper and euphoric. There are different explanations for mood disorders. We do seem to see there's a genetic predisposition because it tends to run in families. We also believe that there's a problem with the serotonin and the neurotransmitters and dopamine, which causes the mood disturbance. Stress hormones, brain structures such as the amygdala, psychological factors and sociological factors all figure in to explaining why a person has depression or why they have bipolar disorder. In getting here where it says, why do women have higher rates of depression than men? Well, one thing I'd like you to think about is, do men report as often as women? Women are very in touch with their bodies, with things, about their bodies, and they're more likely to go to a doctor and say, this isn't normal for me, where guys tend to suck it up. Also, there's biological reasons women have higher rates of depression. There's psychological reasons, and then there's socio-cultural reasons. When we're talking about schizophrenia, this is a severe mental illness. It's diagnosed by the history, the epidemiology of the schizophrenia, and what's called positive and negative symptoms. Typically, the schizophrenia is going to be diagnosed in early adolescence, I'm sorry, excuse me, that's incorrect, in adolescence or early adulthood. So generally, we will see more of the diagnoses starting in the 20s and pretty well wrapping up by the 40s. Men will be generally diagnosed earlier than women. The neurodevelopmental factors in schizophrenia, there'll be abnormalities in the brain structure and neurotransmitter function are associated with schizophrenia. We know that they seem to have an overabundance of dopamine. And these abnormalities may have the origins actually in prenatal and early childhood development. Now we have a thing called positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Now delusions are false beliefs, hallucinations, they're false sensory presentations, okay? Now, a delusion would be a false belief like they might believe they are the president. They might believe that that somebody is stealing from them. They might believe that people are plotting against them or talking about them all the time. Now, hallucinations, they're false sensory perceptions, and that would be, and it can occur with any sense. So that would be something like seeing something that's not there, hearing something that's not there, feeling something that's not there, smelling something that's not there, or feeling like you're touching something that's not there. So a person with a hallucination of schizophrenia might see a person that's not in the room, but they see the person and may be talking to them. I worked with one schizophrenic who believed that there were dead bodies in her room, and she didn't want to leave because she didn't want to step on any of the dead bodies. Okay? Disorganized speech, they will sometimes do a thing called word salad, where they link words together that really doesn't go together. And then they can have disordered behavior. Now, negative symptoms of schizophrenia is their outward appearance is called affect, and they will have what's called, pardon me, blunted affect or flat affect. Flat affect means they don't have any expression whatsoever on their face. Blunted means they might smile once in a while or raise an eyebrow, or maybe the corners of their mouth will go upward a little bit. So they're showing some form of emotional reaction, where flat means they're not forming any. And alogia means they are having problems with speech. That's word salad. That's what I was describing a minute ago. Then we have, and this is where your assignment is centered, personality disorders. Now, there are 3 divisions of personality disorders, and those 3 have several distinct personality disorders located within them. Okay? The first group or cluster of personality disorders is called the cluster A, and they include paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Now, paranoid actually is a pervasive pattern of mistrusting people, being very suspicious of people, being suspicious of their motives, and very often believing that challenging the disloyalty or challenging the loyalty of friends and family. It's not unusual to have them believe that a spouse is unfaithful. Schizoid is where they socially isolate They're very emotionally cold and they're very indifferent to others. Schizotypal, these are people who have peculiar thoughts and behaviors. They have poor interpersonal relationships. They might believe that they have magical powers, like if you come to them, they might be able to think a solution to a problem, like healing something. Okay. Now, antisocial personality disorder is misleading in the name. It doesn't mean they don't want to be around people. That's the big thing to know about antisocial. Here are people that they don't have a conscience. They do not mind hurting people because they don't have any empathy. They fail to conform to social and legal codes. They do not experience guilt. They exhibit irresponsible behaviors. These used to be called your sociopaths and your psychopaths. Okay? The borderline personality disorder, here these people are very, very worried and anxious about being abandoned. They do not, they have severe emotional swings. They can, they have a history of broken relationships. They have a poor self-image, and they usually have a problem with boundaries. Now, the narcissistic personality disorders, they have an exaggerated sense of self-importance and who they are. They have exploitative behavior of others, and they lack empathy as well. Now, going back to antisocial personality disorder, here they demonstrate a chronic pattern of impulsive and irresponsible behavior. It is not uncommon for them to violate the rights of others. They lack empathy, and they do not show remorse or guilt because they really have little or no conscience. The borderline personality disorder, they demonstrate instability, particularly in mood and self-image. They have a history of broken relationships. They tend to have a lack of impulse control. Again, they do not respect boundaries, and they can engage in self-destructive behaviors very often. Your cluster C personality disorders are your fearful behavior disorders. Here you have a person like avoidant personality disorder where they really, really work hard in isolating. They have a constant social inhibition. They have a fear of rejection and humiliation, so therefore, if they don't get into a social situation, they won't have to be humiliated or rejected. So that's one reason why they tend to withdraw. Your dependent personality disorder, they are the needy, clingy ones. And then your OCD, these are your perfectionists. They have repetitive behaviors, intrusive thoughts, repetitive thoughts. Okay? Like I said, they tend to be perfectionist. They try to be controlling, and they also sometimes are very, very devoted to details, and they can be very rigid. Disorders of childhood and adolescence, you have your autism and your ADHD. Autism is characteristic by impairment in social communication, social interactions, and restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. Your ADHD is characterized by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. they have a hard time concentrating. They have a hard time sitting still, and they have a hard time focusing for a length of time on things. And sadly, these are the ones, children, that are often given Ritalin. And Ritalin may not actually be the drug that should help them. And with that, we have finished the abnormal psychology chapter, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it informative. Have a good day.